After my divorce, the last voice I expected to whisper, "Be my husband," was hers. Not a friend, not a stranger, not someone who owed me anything. My boss, Natalie Holt, the most composed, untouchable woman in Nashville's entire financial district. The woman who managed million-dollar portfolios without blinking, who commanded boardrooms full of men twice her age, who had never once in 4 years crossed a single professional line. That woman leaned close in the front seat of my car on a quiet Thursday evening and whispered 3 words that should have been impossible. But here's what nobody knew about Natalie behind that iron composure, behind the sharp blazers, the corner office, and the reputation that made grown executives straighten their ties when she walked in. Behind all of it, she was hiding something. And me? I was a freshly divorced man who had just watched his 9-year marriage dissolve in 15 minutes before a judge who never looked up from his file. A man who drove to work the very next morning because sitting alone felt like something that might actually kill him. I was her employee. She was my boss. The line between us had always been clear, professional, and completely uncrossable. But she whispered it anyway. So why would a woman who had everything, power, wealth, authority, and an entire company under her name, whisper those 3 words to the most broken man in her building? What did she know about me that I didn't know about myself? And what was she hiding behind that whisper that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival? The morning after the divorce, I parked in the Caldwell and Morris garage on Charlotte Avenue and sat inside my car for 11 minutes, staring at a concrete wall like it owed me something. My wedding ring was gone. My finger felt naked. Wrong. Like a word with a letter missing that the eye keeps trying to correct. 9 years, gone in 15 minutes. Brooke hadn't. 15. Cried. That was the thing I couldn't shake. She had signed her name on those papers the way she signed for a package. Clean, efficient, completely unbothered. The man she'd met in Atlanta 8 months earlier had 3 properties and a corner office and apparently everything I was not. She said it had nothing to do with me. People always say that. It always has everything to do with you. I took the elevator to the 14th floor because I had nowhere else to go. Natalie was already at her desk. She was always already at her desk. 4 years, and I had never once beaten her in. She looked up when I passed her doorway, and something shifted behind her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, before the composure locked back into place like a vault door. She called me in, closed the door, and instead of the Hendricks report, she looked at my bare left hand and said simply, "I'm sorry, Daniel." I hadn't told a single soul, she had noticed, and right then, something I couldn't name yet cracked open quietly inside my chest. Too small to be hope, too warm to be nothing. The weeks after divorce don't break you all at once. They break you in pieces, quietly, in the small moments nobody warns you about. The first time you cook for one and stand there staring at the extra plate you almost pulled from the cabinet. The first Saturday morning with no reason to get up. The first time you reach across a bed that is entirely, permanently yours and feel the cold space where a life used to be. My apartment on Belmont Boulevard smelled of fresh paint and felt like a waiting room. I had my books, my work laptop, and a television I kept muted, because the sound of other people's lives felt unbearable in that silence. But every morning, I had the 14th floor. And every morning, without a single word about it, Natalie gave me harder work, not as punishment, as purpose. I understood that difference only later, how a person who truly sees you doesn't offer pity. They hand you something heavy and trust you to carry it. She restructured my entire portfolio assignment 3 days after the divorce, gave me the Meridian account, the most complex file in the building. When I looked up from the brief and found her watching from the doorway, she simply said, "You think better when you're challenged. Don't waste the capacity." Then she walked away. I worked until 9 that night, and when I drove home, the silence in my apartment felt slightly less like drowning. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you've ever been the person sitting in a parking garage at 7 in the morning trying to remember who you are, take a moment right now to like this video, Share it with someone who needs to believe life still has something beautiful ahead. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. These stories exist for the people who need them most. Don't let the next one find you too late. 6 weeks after the divorce, Natalie didn't come in. In 4 years, that had never happened. Not during the ice storm that paralyzed Nashville for 3 days. Not during the week she had bronchitis so severe her voice disappeared entirely. Jenna, her assistant, sat at her desk looking unsettled in a way that made the whole floor feel slightly tilted. Natalie was back the next morning, composed, precise, exactly herself. But something was different. I noticed a new hesitation before she rose from her chair. A stillness in quiet moments that felt less like calm and more like a woman carefully managing something the rest of us couldn't see. A pause in the elevator one afternoon when she thought nobody was watching. Eyes closed, one hand pressed flat against the steel wall, breathing slowly and deliberately like someone reminding themselves how. I said nothing, but I watched. And 3 weeks later, at 9:17 on a Wednesday night, she walked into my office with 2 cups of coffee, sat down across from me, and said something that had absolutely nothing to do with work. "My mother died alone, Daniel." I stopped typing. She had people around her technically. Her voice was even, unhurried, like a woman who had carried a sentence so long it no longer required effort to lift. But she died alone in the way that actually matters, without someone who chose her specifically. She looked up from her coffee. "I've been thinking about that a great deal lately." She left at 9:34, and I sat in that office for a long time after her heels faded down the corridor, staring at the Nashville skyline through the glass, feeling something shift in the air around me that I couldn't explain and wasn't yet brave enough to name. The Thursday morning Natalie told me about the cancer, she didn't sit down. She stood at her office window with her back to me, watching Nashville move 14 floors below like she was memorizing it, like she was storing it somewhere safe. The morning light came through the glass and caught the edges of her profile, and she looked both powerful and breakable in the same breath, the way tall buildings look just before a storm. She had been diagnosed in January, early-stage breast cancer. She had spent 6 weeks handling it exactly the way she handled everything, alone, methodically, without burdening a single soul with the weight of it. She had her doctors, her treatment plan, her calendar blocked in precise intervals. She had engineered her own survival with the same discipline she applied to everything in her life. What she had not engineered was someone to drive her home. The clinic had advised against driving after the first infusion. She had gone through her mental list, the entire list, and discovered, with a clarity that had clearly shaken something loose inside her, that there was nobody on it she felt she could call. She turned from the window. "I'm telling you because I trust your discretion," she said, "not to make this your problem." I looked at her for a moment, this woman who moved markets, who built a company from a single rented office on Fifth Avenue into 14 floors of controlled excellence, who had never once asked anyone for anything she couldn't quantify, justify, or repay. "I'll drive you," I said. "Daniel, Thursday. The infusion is Thursday morning." 7 seconds of silence. "Yes," she said finally, quietly, like the word cost her something. I drove her Thursday morning. I waited 4 hours in a chair that was aggressively uncomfortable, reading a financial quarterly I'd already memorized, while somewhere down a corridor, the most formidable woman I had ever known sat alone in a treatment chair and refused to let anyone see her afraid. I drove her home Thursday afternoon. She slept most of the way. Her left hand rested against the passenger window, trembling slightly from the medication moving through her system. Not from fear, from the sheer physical effort of fighting something invisible. And even then, even diminished, even exhausted, even stripped of every blazer and boardroom, she was still entirely herself, still formidable, still precise in her stillness. I drove her every Thursday for 5 weeks, and on the 5th Thursday, she didn't open the door when I pulled into her driveway in Green Hills. She sat looking at her hands in her lap. The engine ticked quietly in the cooling evening air. The neighborhood was still, the kind of still that makes every sound feel like it means something. Then she whispered it. "Be my husband." Not romantically. Those were her next words, delivered to her own hands before I could respond. Not that way. She meant someone who showed up on purpose, someone who chose to be present not because a contract required it, but because they decided to. She had a company. She had a strategy for everything. She had 7 employees whose futures she managed with more careful attention than she had ever given her own life. She had nothing that resembled what I had done for 5 Thursdays in a row. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were clear and exhausted in equal measure, the eyes of a woman who had been strong for so long she had forgotten to leave a door open for anyone to walk through. I walked her to her door that evening without answering. I drove home through Nashville in a silence that felt nothing like the silence I had been living in for months. This one had weight, texture, direction. This one was asking me something. I thought about Brooke's steady hand on those courthouse papers, about how love can expire quietly in the space between 2 people who stop truly seeing each other, about how I had driven to work the morning after my divorce because I had nowhere else that felt real, and how, without ceremony or announcement, the 14th floor had become the most real place in my life. I thought about a woman who had noticed my bare finger on the worst morning of my year, who had handed me harder work instead of hollow comfort, who had pressed her palm flat against an elevator wall when she thought nobody was watching and breathed herself back to steady. I called her the next morning. "When you said you didn't mean it romantically," I said, "did you mean that completely? Or were you protecting yourself from the answer?" 7 seconds. "Both," she said. "Possibly." What followed wasn't a movie. There was no rooftop declaration over the Nashville skyline. There were conversations, long, careful, completely honest conversations in her kitchen on Sunday mornings with green tea she drank because her mother had in light coming through the windows in a way that made everything feel slower and more important. There were walks along the Cumberland River as her treatment continued, and the Tennessee air turned warm, and the city moved around us indifferent and beautiful. There were arguments about professional ethics and reasonable boundaries, and the specific recklessness of 2 people who both knew better choosing each other anyway. Her cancer responded to treatment. By August, her oncologist used the word encouraging with a certainty that made Natalie Holt, composed, untouchable, iron-spined Natalie Holt, come completely apart for 45 seconds in a Vanderbilt Medical Center parking lot. She stood beside my car with her fingers pressed to her eyes and her shoulders shaking and made no sound whatsoever. And I stood beside her without speaking, without moving, without trying to fix it, because some moments don't need fixing. They just need witness. When she finished, she straightened her blazer. "Don't mention this at the office," she said. "Obviously," I said, and she laughed, genuinely, completely unguarded. 3 full seconds of pure, unperformed joy from a woman who had kept every real thing about herself behind professional glass for longer than either of us could calculate. It was the most honest sound I had ever heard another human being make. I knew then, completely and without reservation. We married the following spring at a vineyard outside Franklin, Tennessee. Small ceremony. Late afternoon light pouring gold across everything. Jenna cried from the moment Natalie appeared at the end of the aisle to the moment the officiant said, "Amen," which Natalie had predicted with complete statistical accuracy. My brother stood beside me and squeezed my shoulder and said nothing because nothing was exactly right. When Natalie walked toward me, she didn't look like a boss. She didn't look like an executive or an authority or the woman who made grown men straighten their ties. She looked like someone who had carried everything alone for a very long time and had finally, deliberately, decided to put some of it down. Marriage to Natalie is not simple. She sends calendar invites for important conversations. She reads quarterly reports at the breakfast table and does not apologize for it. She is precise and demanding and occasionally exhausting in the most extraordinary way. But she calls me first. When the scan results come back, when a difficult meeting ends, when she opens the bottom drawer of her desk and looks at her mother's photograph on a hard afternoon and needs someone to know she did it without needing to explain why. She calls me first. And that, after everything, is the whole of it. The entire architecture of everything I thought I had lost and everything I never knew I was waiting to find. I walked out of that courthouse on Charlotte Avenue on a Tuesday in March, believing the best of my life was already behind me. I was wrong by a distance I still cannot measure, because the most broken version of me walked onto a 14th floor with a bare finger and hollow eyes, and the woman who ran that floor saw something in me worth saving before I believed there was anything left worth saving at all. She whispered 3 words that changed everything, and it turned out the most important thing my boss ever gave me had nothing to do with work. If this story reached something inside you, if you've ever been that person sitting in a parking garage at 7 in the morning wondering if life still has something real ahead, please take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to this channel. And make sure you turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one, because the next story might be the one that changes everything for you or someone you love. Before we end, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. Have you ever been seen, truly, quietly, completely seen, by someone you never expected, at the exact moment you had stopped believing you were worth seeing? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from. And type the words, "She saw me," if this story found you at the right time. Because sometimes the person who witnesses your worst moment, without flinching, without running, without making it about themselves, is the person your entire life was quietly building toward. Natalie didn't save me from divorce. She saved me from disappearing. And the whisper that should have ended everything turned out to be the first sentence of the only story that ever truly mattered.